because it now has plumbing and drainage in there as well. So it's an overall code for all development. And for those that aren't aware, you can get it in hard copy that you can see there. Volume 2 is the housing provisions, it's maroon. Volume 1 is blue, and that's class 2 to 9s. You can get it online like you guys can. You should all be subscribed through the website, through the library, sorry, to get it online. And if you wanted to, you can actually buy it online, buy a disc, which is quite a good resource, because on the disc it has all the reference standards as well, which is quite a lot of money. So the objective of this training module is just to provide fundamental information on the operation and application of the BCA. The BCA is a mandatory building code applied throughout Australia. Now, the BCA in of itself does not have any statutory powers. It has to be given power through enabling legislation, such as in Queensland, the Building Act 1975. So if you go to section 30 of the Building Act 1975, if you're in Queensland, you'll see that one of the building assessment provisions that is referenced is the Building Code of Australia. So that's what gives it standing, I guess you could say. Now, because it's subordinate legislation and it's called up under the Building Act, due to legal convention, if there's any discrepancy between the BCA and the Building Code, the Building Act, the Building Act will take effect, or the Building Act will override to the extent of the inconsistency. And if you go to section 109, I think it is, of the Commonwealth Constitution, you can see how that process applies to Commonwealth and state legislation. So, Module 1, the background of the BCA, operation of the BCA, and application of the BCA. Okay, so the background of the BCA, it's building regulation systems. It's the Australian Building Codes Board, and it's the role of the BCA. That's what we'll be touching on. The operation of the BCA will be the structure of the BCA, the content of Volume 1, the content of Volume 2, and how the BCA content is changed. Now, in this presentation, we're really only going to be looking at the background to the BCA. We're not going to go in at this stage to the operation in any detail or the application, but we will look at those in further presentations. And the application of the BCA is when to apply the BCA, how to comply with it, how to apply Volume 1, how to apply Volume 2. Now, how to apply Volume 1, this is to do with classifications. We might as well say it now. Volume 1 only applies to classes 2 to 9 buildings, so are you guys familiar with 2 to 9? So class 2 is units, basically, residential units. Class 3 are motels, hotel accommodation. Class 4 is caretakers. Class 5 is offices. Class 6 shops. 7A is a car park. 7B is storage. 8's factories. And then class 9A, 9A will be your hospitals. 9B will be entertainment centres, schools, buildings of a public nature, and 9Cs are your private health, aged care homes. Sorry. It also, within Volume 1, you will also have some Class 10As, which are private garages and sheds, and some Class 10Bs, which mainly would be swimming pools. So, which leaves us with Volume 2, which is what the content of our course this semester is about, which are the housing provisions. Now, that only looks after Class 1As, which are single detached residence or duplexes, and they can be townhouses as well, or row of houses. The difference between a Class 1A and a Class 2 is your Class 1A has a fire separating wall. It can only have a wall, whereas a Class 2 can have a fire separating wall and floor. So in a Class 1A, you cannot have one Class A above the other. If that's the case, it's a Class 2. It also applies to Class 1Bs, which are bed and breakfast type accommodations that are up to 300 square metres and not more than 12 people accommodated. Again, Class 10As and Class 10Bs. So that's what we're looking at in Volume 2, all of those types of buildings, just the residential essential class of building. So, background of the BCA, building regulation systems. The Australian Constitution gives states and territories general responsibility for regulating building activity within their state or territory. Therefore, Australia has 8 separate building regulation systems and probably about 80,000 different town planning schemes, but that's another thing altogether. Even though there are 8 systems, the content of each is reasonably similar. which is true. Generally there's an act which is enabling legislation and there's a regulation which is subordinate legislation. So that's what we find within Australia. Why do we need to regulate building work? First and foremost, it's a protection of people, building occupants plus people outside a building. And we have to protect them during construction, during the operational life of the building and during demolition. Also protection of property. And we're primarily looking at protection of adjacent property rather than the subject property. So that's why we'll have a building that has walls constructed to what's called an FRL, a fire resistance level, to stop the passage of hot gas or flames or radiant heat to adjoining properties. That's why we're looking at those things. So that's what we're looking at with the BCA. We want to protect people first and foremost, and then property. Okay. In addition to that, recently 2003, sustainable development became a addition to the BCA, and that was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce energy, improve energy efficiency of buildings, and also look at future climate change mitigation. So basically the BCA in Volume 2 looks at the building fabric and some of the operational features of a building, and it looks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by improving insulation, glazing efficiency, so on and so forth. Some operational things are light globes and hot water systems, those sort of things. So that's also in the BCA. In 2005 they amended that and enhanced the regulations, and also in 2005 energy efficiency requirements for classes 2 to 9s took effect. So why do we regulate building work? Main sources of risk to life are structural collapse of a building or fire in a building, but also we all have health and amenity issues, which are dampness, sanitation, ventilation, lighting and sound transmission. And dampness can actually be quite a dangerous one. If you've heard of, actually probably dampness and ventilation comes into a thing called sick building syndrome, and where you have issues with mould, you can actually have fatalities from mould in a building. So the BCA seeks to regulate these to provide a safe environment. So if the regulation of building works, just remember that absolute outcomes are not definable. Therefore, we need to facilitate acceptable levels of risks, assess whether regulation is necessary and or desirable through rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and if so, establish minimum standards. And that's what the BCA does, and every year, 1 May, the BCA has amendments that take effect. And this year, there's a number of amendments, but probably the most significant amendment that's taking effect from 1 May is the requirement for Class 1As and sole occupancy units in Class 2s, 3s and 4s to have handrails in stairs. Because up till now it was not mandatory to have handrails. But the ABCB's been doing a lot of research of late as to, in relation to slips and falls in buildings, and has determined that handrails are a quantifiable factor in reducing the risk of strips and falls. Therefore, under the amendments from this year on, we have handrails in buildings. So that's how the, in a way, the process of the cost-benefit analysis would work. But there's a lot more detail that we could go into on that. So in a typical system, a regulation system generally comprises 2 types, the administrative regulation and the technical regulation. The administrative is why you do something or who you do something for, and the technical regulation is how you actually do it. How do you achieve those regulations? Okay, so examples of administrative issues or administrative parts of a regulation are powers and responsibilities, assessment procedures, referrals, objections and appeals, the inspection and certification process, offences and penalties, and adoption of the building code. And you'll find those within Queensland in the Building Regulation 2006, and other states and territories would have similar legislation as far as a regulation goes. Technical regulations can include building requirements such as protection of adjoining property during construction, hoarding to protect the public, signage to warn the public of hazardous materials, design and construction requirements of building and structures. Now, with the regulations, don't believe that the BCA is the only technical legislation or technical standard you have to use. The BCA calls up a number of adopted standards, such as, not in the case of Volume 2, but in Volume 1, if you can see that. That's AS 1428. That's the standard for access for disability access standard into buildings. So that'll be a reference standard that you'll see in the front of the BCA. It'll show you where the reference standards are. In addition to that, quite often states and territories will have other codes or legislation that you have to comply with. In Queensland, there's a suite of building codes or construction codes, I guess you could call them, called the Queensland Development Code. Now, the QDC looks at things such as design and siting, specialist buildings, pool fencing, a range of issues like that. So they exist above and beyond the BCA as well. And the reason that Queensland went down the path of having the QDC or Queensland Development Code was they didn't want to wait for the most state and territory variations and put it into the BCA. So if you look at the BCA, you'll see that Queensland has very few state or territory variations. All of our variations are contained within the Queensland Development Code, which you get off the website at DLGP, Department of Local Government and Planning. So for those guys that are in Queensland, just be aware that the QDC is out there as well. Okay. Now, the BCA is a performance-based code setting minimum performance requirements for the design, construction and performance of buildings. By agreement, the BCA is adopted through state and territory legislation as the primary technical standard for their building regulatory system. So this is from COAG, the Commonwealth of Australian Governments. So they all get together, all the states, and they've decided that the BCA is the way to go, which makes sense. It's sensible to have one uniform standard for design and construction throughout Australia. So that's the background of the BCA. Now what we're going to look at is the Australian Building Codes Board, or ABCB, just briefly, because these are the guys that look after the administration of the building code. And that's just my phone ringing, sorry, but we'll just let that ring through. It'll go to message bank in a second. So the background: for over 40 years Australian governments have worked to achieve national consistency in building regulations. Their activities are founded on a cooperative arrangement and the achievements that derive from political goodwill and national interest. So they're not compelled to do it under legislation, it is voluntary, but it is a sensible way to go.
Is that for us?
Okay. In the early 90s, a Council of Australian Governments, or COAG, task force recommended the establishment of a national body to assist in achieving national consistency in building regulations.
Yes, you can.
The Australian Building Codes Board, ABCB, came into existence through an intergovernmental agreement in 1994. So prior to that, every state and territory had their own building legislation. In Queensland, we had the Building Act 1975, which we still have. But in addition to that, we had the standard building bylaws, which were a prescriptive piece of legislation that govern building construction. Now, prescriptive means that it's essentially a recipe and it doesn't have any options. You must do this or you must do that. So it may say that all walls must be made out of 70 by 35 mm MGP 15 timber. And that's it. You don't get a say beyond that. You must do it that way. The BCA is performance-based, although the first BCA was a prescriptive-based document. Okay, so the role of the ABCB is to address issues relating to health, safety, amenity and sustainability by providing for efficiency in the design, construction and performance of buildings through the BCA and the development of effective regulatory systems. So the BCA administers the building code. And they've got an office in Canberra with quite a number of people. I was in Canberra just the other week, actually, at a ABCB seminar, and we went to the ABCB offices and met a number of the people, and it's quite a large organisation and does a very good job. Okay, so the ABCB is governed by a board. The board consists of representatives from Australian governments, the Australian government, state and territory governments, local government, the building and construction industry, and has an independent chairperson. The ABCB has an office, full-time staff to assist the board in achieving its goals, and that's the one in Canberra. So industry representatives on the ABCB, I think the HIA are on there, the Master Builders are on there, the Australian Institute of Building Surveyors are on there. There's a number of industry bodies on there to make sure that anything that comes through is really reflects the needs of the industry and is sensible, I guess you could say. The board is assisted by a Building Codes Committee that is chaired by the ABCB General Manager and has representatives again from Australian Government, State and Territory, New Zealand, Fire Services Authorities, research bodies and again the building and construction industry. So it has a range of stakeholders that have given voice to that board. The BCC advises the ABCB on technical content for the BCA, general building regulatory matters, submissions from industry groups and regulatory reform strategies. So the BCA is not a static document, it's a live document and it's constantly evolving. As I say, 1 May every year you get amendments to the BCA and that's when this process has life, I guess. When they've looked at the amendments, they go through a rigorous process and then they get adopted if they stand up. Okay, so, and also in addition to that, development is assisted by specialist committees. These include Energy Efficiency Policy Steering Committees, Core Strategic Group, Code Mark Committee, and you may want to have a look at Code Mark in answering your assignment, or some of your assignment questions, because it may be of assistance there. So just have a look at what Code Mark is all about. So the primary aims again of building regulations are to protect people, protect adjacent property and to protect the environment. The ABCB is responsible for development of the BCA and the role of the BCA is to establish acceptable minimum standards. Now Nate, that's a fairly important point, minimum standards. The BCA is a minimum standard document. There is nothing stopping you going above and beyond the BCA. So if it says that a wall that is subject to a fire source feature, an adjoining boundary has to have an FRL or fire resistance level of 60-60-60, which means it must withstand fire for 60 minutes for the spread of flame, the spread of smoke and insulate. You can go to 120 minutes if you want. If you decide you want to go to 120 minutes, you can. You cannot go less than 60 minutes, but you can go more than 60 minutes, okay? So it's a minimum standard document. So just bear that in mind as well. So operation of the BCA, we'll touch on some of this, the characteristics of the BCA. Now, this is probably getting into more interesting ground for you guys to get an idea about what the BCA is and how it works. First of all, it is a performance-based building code that presents a minimum technical building regulation. Performance building codes set mandatory levels of performance that must be achieved. However, the BCA allows flexibility in how compliance with respective performance requirements is achieved. Now, with the performance-based BCA, the only mandatory level of compliance with the BCA is the performance requirements. That is what you have to satisfy. One way of satisfying that is through deemed to satisfy that we'll look at. Now, why do you have performance-based legislation? The main reasons is it allows flexibility to allow acceptable solutions other than standard practice. It also allows the design of tailor-made buildings, so you can have no more of the one-size-fits-all, as they say. If there's a special site requirements or so forth, you can use a performance-based approach to design a specific building. So performance-based legislation essentially, it encourages efficiency, it encourages innovation, and it tries to encourage cost-effectiveness. So that's why we have performance-based. As I say, as compared to descriptive-based legislation, which just lays out a recipe that you must do. You don't have any other choice. So this sort of significantly frees up creative energies to look at alternative solutions. Acceptable options to standard practice are called alternative solutions, and as I said, alternative solutions may be used to improve cost effectiveness, improve constructability, incorporate innovation, and address anything different to standard practice. You mainly see alternative solutions at the moment in fire engineering, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with fire engineering as a concept, but that's where they may decide that they don't want to put in a fire hydrant system because they don't have enough water, so they'll get a fire engineer to maybe look at putting in sprinklers, so sprinklering the entire building. That's not a deemed to satisfy, that's an alternative solution. But provided that that solution can be shown to equal or be better than the performance requirement, that's fine to do it that way. Some but not all approving authorities can approve alternative solutions. Okay, performance-based regulations reduce the need to lodge objections to regulations, apply for a modification or variation, or appeal decisions to certifying authorities. Now in Queensland, for argument's sake, you cannot approve an alternative solution for a building fire service feature without advice from Queensland Fire Rescue Service, QFRS. They're an advice agency for that matter. So the alternative solution has to go through those people. If you don't agree with their advice, they can appeal as far as that goes. But if you want to do an alternative solution, or if you want to assess and approve an alternative solution, say as the exam question is for a ceiling height, then there are no referral agencies. That is a decision the certifier can make. So provided you justify your decision, you record your decision, you show the methodology used, that's fine. So it depends on the nature of the alternative solution, whether or not there's a referral agency, so a third party that gets to have a look at it, or whether it's just for the certifier too. And for designers, that goes along as well. You can design it, the design's always going to be the design, it just depends how many people get to assess it. Now for certifiers, you cannot do your own alternative solution for a client because that's a conflict of interest. You can't design and certify something. So you would need to get, the client would need to engage a designer that you deem a competent person or an expert, and then you assess that alternative solution. It can't be done in-house. Think for a while. So we'll have a little break for a minute. Just so you guys, if anyone has any questions or any comments to make, this is a chance now just to have a bit of have your chance to sort of say anything you want. If you don't have a microphone, remember down in the bottom right hand corner there's a text box. So if you want to have a question, all you do is type your question here. And then just send it, and then that question will come up. Okay, so Rick wants to know, why is the New Zealand government part of the board? I think the New Zealand government's part of the board because some of the Australian standards are Australian-New Zealand standards. So I think it might be an efficiency just to see that that changes don't get made to standards through the BCA process that may affect them. Although Australian standards are not a government organisation, they're a private organisation. But yeah, I think they're there for that reason, and I think also they're probably there because the BCA is one of the best building codes in the world. It is a really very efficient, very good document. So they may be wanting to learn from us as well, I guess. I don't have a definite, but I think that's why that is, but I can find out. So if anyone else, yep, okay, thanks. That's good. So if anyone else has any questions, just text away or type in the box there or just ask me, because this is the idea. I'd like to get a bit of feedback and see what you guys think about this stuff. Okay, well, we'll keep going. Now, can you think of a time when you wanted to build something different to standard practice? So you guys are you're either going to be building surveyors, building designers or project managers. Think about, has anything ever come to you, or have you ever had to do anything that's outside of the different standard practice? And then, if you have, is there a benefit in able to do things the way you'd like to do it? Is it better, or is it better to have a purely prescriptive thing that you can't go outside? And I mean, can't go outside those rules. There you go. Tell us about your experiences, if you've come across this before. If you haven't, either just post something up on our the general forum page. Type a question here, just think about what it is, how the BCA works. So the role of the BCA is to provide a technical base to the design and construction of buildings that is acceptable for adoption by individual states and territories Through its adoption in all states and territories, it delivers a high degree of national consistency to minimum acceptable regulations. Again, remember, minimum. It is a minimum standard, not the maximum. Australia has a coveted record in the performance of its building regulation and the safety of its building. History indicates that our building regulations are effective. The fundamental design concepts of the BCA are derived from building practice or building codes in place prior to the BCA. So the first building code that we know about was by a guy called Hammurani, I think it was, in about 4000 BC, and it was a purely prescriptive performance-based code. It said if a builder builds a building and it falls down and kills the owner, then the builder gets killed. So pretty simple building code, make it stand up. It's evolved through time. That probably the modern history was probably in the Great Fire of London. I think it was around 1690, and I think it was the architect Christopher Wren was the architect, the government architect / building surveyor, and they introduced minimum standards as far as fire separation with the use of bricks, not having chimneys where there were thatched roofs so that the embers and that could set fire to the roofs and so on and so forth it goes. And so from there it's evolved through Australia, and I think in your readings you'll see that it talks about the introduction into Sydney, and you know, it's evolved from there. Queensland, as I say, really kicked off around 1975 with the standard building bylaws. Before that time it was either local authorities that had building regulations, or the Commonwealth Bank had a book out on minimum specifications for building to get a loan with the Commonwealth Bank. So this is where the building legislation's evolved from, and what you find with a lot of this stuff is that it's basically codified common practice or community expectation. One of your assignment questions is to do an alternative solution for a ceiling that's less than the 2.4 metre height. The problem with this is I don't know anyone who knows why ceilings are at 2.4 metres. Why not 2.7? Why not 2.3? When you're doing an alternative solution, it does help to know the basis of this. Now, I'll give you an example of this that you may not have come across yet, but when you're looking at disability access into buildings, where there's a ramp or step or stairs, it requires that you have handrails on both sides of the ramp or stairs. Now, can anyone think why you need handrails on both sides of the ramp or stairs, not just on one side? Just give you a second. Someone wants to type an answer in or make a comment.
Oh, I think it's basically because you're either left-handed or right-handed.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? No. That's almost it. But what it is it's really looking at people that have got an ambulant disability, and think of strokes. When someone has a stroke, it affects their left or right hemisphere, so they can either use their left hand or right hand. So because we're looking at disability access, it's predominantly to cater for those people. Now, if you don't know why you have to have a handrail on both sides of a ramp or stairs and the significance of it, it's hard to do an alternative solution in the dark, so to speak. That's why disabled toilets, where there's more than one, they require a left-hand, right-hand mirror image of the facilities, because again, after strokes and so on and so forth, people have a preference or can only use their left hand or right hand. So when you're doing an alternative solution, they're the sort of things you need to be aware of, and that's why doing the alternative solution for the ceiling height might be challenging, because it's pretty hard to work out exactly why it's at 2.4 metres. It really, I think, is a codification of community standards and community expectations. But there are ways of doing it, and I'm sure you guys will get to that. Okay, the origin of the BCA again. In addition, science has underpinned the development of new provisions to produce a more effective code. So think of fire rating, different fire rating materials that have come along. So Hebel would be an example of that perhaps. Therefore, the content of the BCA is derived from a combination of time-proven historical regulation and scientifically based modern regulation. So the historical regulation is what I'm talking about with the codification of community expectation. Scientifically based modern regulation. Have a look at some of the fire engineering and some of the fire-based solutions. And if you're interested and this will probably come up in your future studies. Have a look on the web and Google search something called NIST, and that stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's the American version of the ABCD, and there's a massive amount of information there on fire engineering. They've got a lot of reports on the collapse of the World Trade Center. They've got computer simulations of how it happened. There's huge amounts of information on the NIST website, so that'll give you an idea of the scientifically based approach to the building regulation. So the goals of the BCA, the goals are stated in the introduction. In essence, the goals are to deliver minimum acceptable standards of structural sufficiency or structural adequacy, safety, sustainability, health and amenity within buildings for the benefit of the community. Hence we talk from class 1A dwellings right the way up to aged care facilities and everything in between. So that's what the BCA looks for. It is important to mention that these stated goals are applied so that the content of the BCA extends no further than is necessary in the public interest. Therefore it's cost effective, easily understood and not necessarily onerous, because if you make it too expensive or too hard, people may not do it, and that'll defeat the purpose of the BCA. Now that is the end of the slideshow presentation.